Now for our Entre Nous segment, and today we're focusing on the 10th anniversary of the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks. Solange Mougin is in the studio with me. Solange, good to see you. 12 people at the satirical newspaper were killed in those attacks of January 2015, and France has a long tradition of satire. Is this kind of humor specifically French?
Well, satire is not specifically French. Other nations also have a long tradition of it and of satirical cartoons. But the French are attached to this art form of poking fun. So I've taken a deep dive into the archives. But before we go into its history, let's define exactly what satire is, as it may feel to some like a bit of a vague literary concept. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the first definition, which is what we're concerned with here, is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other issues. Now, when it comes to France, already in the Middle Ages, satire had a strong place in society. Les bouffons du roi, or royal buffoons or court jesters, they were allowed to poke fun at the king to amuse the courts. Well, with the banning of them and the 1564 law outlawing all caricatures of Henry III, and then Richelieu's censorship law of 1629, the outlet of satire was actually taken on largely by writers. Molière and Jean de La Fontaine are good examples about how plays and fables can mock the powerful. Now, cartoonists, they became one of the emblems of French satire during the French Revolution. Over 1,500 satirical engravings were published then, and it grew from there.
It's at this time when cartoons and caricatures developed. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, this phenomenon grew from leaflets and pamphlets to newspapers with the development of printing techniques.
Et les capacités d'impression croissantes des journaux.
Now, when it comes to satire in France, there are two laws that were and still are the cornerstone of satire. That's the Human Rights Law of 1789, establishing the freedom of expression, and the 1881 Law for the freedom of the press. And it is these fundamental tenets that brought millions of people out into the streets 10 years ago in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. The vast majority of them did not read and still do not read the newspaper. There is this strong belief in these precious ideals of freedom of expression, and that Charlie Hebdo and other papers and other cartoonists fight for.
So where did Charlie Hebdo get its start, Solange?
Well, Charlie Hebdo was quite literally born out of a need to, not only for people to poke fun at the government, at religions, at institutions, but also as a way to get around censorship. In 1970, the government tried to curb the distribution of the paper Harakiri because of its headline, "A tragic ball at Colombey, one death." We see it there. Now, like with a lot of satire, the headline does not seem offensive today, but it was at the time for many people. Let me give you some of the context. In that month of November 1970, 148 people died in a disco fire. Then, 9 days later, Charles de Gaulle died. So the paper was poking fun at the passing of this French icon, de Gaulle, and comparing his death, one man, to the death of so many more people. It was in bad taste to many, but for others, that was the point of the satire. Nonetheless, the government tried to censor Harakiri, so Charlie Hebdo was created to sort of bypass these rules. And on its first issue, you can see that pushback. You have the headline that reads, "There is no censorship in France," and you have a man walking with a cane saying, "Freedom of the press, ? Better to hear that than to be deaf." Now, over the past half century, Charlie Hebdo, but also other papers like the Canard Enchaîné and also other mediums too, like the puppet show Les Guignols, Groland, and also on social media, there is this strong tradition of poking fun, of making people uncomfortable, of attacking with humor to get people thinking about society, to get us thinking about our own limits as well, all of which the cartoonist Plantu, who used to draw for Le Monde, describes.
It's a way to say things, to not take oneself too seriously, to mock, to annoy. Our job is to annoy and be a thorn in one's side. We do good where it hurts.
So, Solange, how is satire doing in France? Is it a dying art form, or is there more support than there's ever been?
Well, let's start with the concerning, and then we'll get to the more hopeful. According to Le Monde, there are just over 30 cartoonists that have a press card today, whereas in 1950, there were more than 200 of them. This is in part because people read papers less, which is part of a wider crisis in journalism.
The problem is not so much the state of cartoons in the press, it's the state of the press on the whole. It's an economic problem, billionaires buying up papers. The fact is that the press is doing so badly. Maybe the press is starting to cut back on cartoonists because they don't think it's their top priority. I think there's something to worry about, but not just for cartoons in the press, but the press in general.
Now, there is the issue as well, though, of changing taste in regard to satire. Things that were offensive a decade ago may not be today, but the opposite can be true as well. Some of us have less taste for it. Some auto-censor themselves, including in the press. It is an ever-changing continuum, for better or worse. And potentially blatant censorship of satirical cartoons, well, it still exists, even in Western nations. Take a potential example. Just last week, cartoonist Anton resigned from the Washington Post because it refused to publish a cartoon mocking the paper's owner, Jeff Bezos, of him bowing down to Donald Trump. Telnys said it was censorship. The paper says that it didn't run the cartoon because it was repetitive. Another example, the New York Times, it pulled its cartoon section entirely in 2019. Here in France, satirical cartoons and papers still exist, but they may be a dying or at least ill art form, at least in the newspaper form. That doesn't mean, though, that humor and satire and the controversies that they create are gone. The radio host, humorist Guillaume Maurice, his firing over jokes about Benjamin Netanyahu comes to mind in that regard. So that's the concerning part. The positive, at least for today, comes from the Jean Jaurès Foundation, which did a study with Charlie Hebdo for the occasion of this anniversary, and it found that contrary to what many believe, the right to mock, to blasphemy, to the use of cartoons in a satirical way is, for 76% of the French population, an integral part of freedom of expression. And this belief, well, it is actually growing.
Okay, interesting stuff. Solange, thank you very much for that. Solange Mougin there with our Entre Nous segment. Paris Direct continues after a quick break. Stay with us.